Hi, today we're going to talk about the Mongols, who originated from the Mongolian steppes. This picture here on your right looks like the open fields that they lived on, and they were good horseback riders. This is another picture, kind of where they're from. It's north of China, made up of many different tribes and clans. Alright, a little Mongol background. They were broken into tribes. They were a mixture of religions, and they were skilled ironworkers. They lived on the steppes, which is those open fields I was just showing you, and they were nomadic. They rode horses or ponies. The Mongolian horses are much smaller than your average size horse. Goats, sheep, cattle, and they would set up camps and live in what are called gurs or yurts, which were movable tents that looked like this. They had an open top here and a door, and they were round, sort of semi-permanent, and they would move them with them as they went. Because they were nomadic, it helped them in battle because they could quickly engage and move faster than other people who lived in more permanent settlements. Alright, the most famous Mongol in history is Genghis Khan, whose original name was Temujin, also known as Chinggis Khan, and that's the title he got, which means universal ruler. His name over history, especially with European speakers, got changed to Genghis Khan, which we know him as today. But if you said it correctly, it would be Chinggis. His grandfather was a great leader, or Khan, and alongside and during these battles with the various different tribes, his father was poisoned, and ultimately Genghis Khan was captured and escaped. He joined a new powerful clan, and by 1206 he had defeated the other Mongol tribes from that part of the world in the north of China, and he was elected the supreme ruler. There's a famous story about how he convinced, or his mother convinced, Genghis and his brothers to not fight each other, and essentially asked them to stay united together, and that they would be stronger that way. Alright, so why was he so successful? He was a brilliant organizer. He was a gifted strategist. He used new weapons and technology that he learned from the people he conquered in many cases. He also wasn't afraid to use cruelty and violence as a weapon, so he was greatly feared. So, what made them so successful? They used horse cavalry, and they were expected to be brave. They used this very famous recurved short bow that had a range of about 350 yards, and they were able to very accurately shoot it from a horse back while riding. And they moved quickly because they were nomads. I mentioned that before. They also incorporated the ideas of other cultures. So here's another portrayal of Genghis Khan. This kind of scary guy. But essentially, one thing to remember is that he expected his conquered people to pay taxes, and if they didn't, then he took everything from them. As you can see from this little summary here, he said, I'll take your prosperity. If you don't have that, I'll take your children. If you don't have that, I'll take your wife. And if you don't have that, I'll take your head. So using cruelty was effective. Alright, here is the Mongol Empire at its height. It was the largest land empire in the history of the world, and at its height you can see that it encompassed China, much of what is Russia, what is much of the Middle East, and then this whole part here, so in Central Asia. So it was a huge land empire, but it didn't last very long. And so after his death, Genghis Khan's death, then it does split eventually into 4 distinctive areas, and you can kind of see them outlined here and here more clearly. So we talked about this when we were talking about early Russia. Remember the Khanate of the Golden Horde and Batu Khan. There's this area here, which was much of Persia. This part here that was Central Asia, And then this larger part here, that was much of what is China, and including, of course, Mongolia. They're all listed here: the Great Khan, the Khanate of the Chagatai, the Ilkhan Empire, and the Khanate of the Golden Horde. Alright, so one thing that they do is very early on, they capture Baghdad. So Hulagu, who is a descendant of Genghis Khan, captures Baghdad in 1258 and kills the last Abbasid Caliph. Remember, we talked about the Abbasid Dynasty when we were doing Islam. They established the Ilkhan state, which lasts from about 1256 to 1335, and it is said to have been a really brutal and destructive attack, with about 200,000 people dying in Baghdad, and they burned the city to the ground. So what did it do? It disrupted the Islamic trade and the paper money economy that they had, and it really does sort of set the stage for the rise of some new powers that come later. If you remember from the Byzantine Empire, the rise of the Ottoman Turks, who take over some parts of that area in the next century. Alright, here's a portrayal of Hulagu Khan and his wife, the one who captured Baghdad in 1258 and killed the last Abbasid Caliphate. Alright, this guy's an interesting guy. Timur, or Tamerlane, sometimes he's called. He has a lot of different names too. He's ruled from 1370 to 1405, and you can see he rules much of the modern Middle East here. He was not a Mongol per se, and not a descendant of Genghis Khan, but some people say he was the most brutal and harsh of all the Mongolian rulers. So he actually kind of comes right at the end of the period of the Mongol rule. But he created what is called the Pyramid of Heads out of skulls. And he is said to have helped, because of his own intellect, usher in a period of science and philosophy and history. Alright, so back to Russia. From about 1240 to 1502, the Golden Horde in Russia was in place, and that was with Batu Khan, at least at the beginning of that time. They were tolerant, they allowed Russians to keep their positions, and they also are known for cutting off the West. You might remember we talked about Alexander Nevsky. This is a portrayal of him right here. He's famous for winning the battle on the ice. He also decided to convince them to submit to Mongol rule. Alright, so the big one is the Yuan Dynasty in China, sometimes called the Yuan Dynasty in China, that lasted from about 1279 to 1368. And they take over much of what is present-day China. And the leader was Kublai Khan, who's famous descendant of Genghis Khan, his son. Alright, so they ushered in a period of peace. You might remember the term Pax Romana when we were studying Rome. They usher in the Pax Mongolica, which is a period of peace in Mongolian time period. They tolerated Chinese culture, but they didn't let them serve in positions at the top, and they often sort of chose foreigners over the Chinese. And they also encouraged foreign trade and foreign merchants to live and work in China, which ushers in some travelers, some very famous traveler we'll talk about in a minute. They moved the capital to Beijing. They had heavy taxes, which was pretty indicative or normal for Mongolians. Paper money, a social system where the Mongols were on the top, followed by Central Asians, Middle Easterners, North Chinese, and then ultimately South Chinese, who continued to put up some resistance. They brought in Muslim administrators because they had been very effective in their own empire. And they did destroy much of the countryside. The population decreases by about 40% during their period. But there is a tremendous growth in science. Alright, the famous traveler I was talking about is Marco Polo, who visited China during Kublai Khan's reign. And he is said to have been a Venetian merchant. Remember, Venice is an important trading city-state. He told his stories to another man in prison when he was imprisoned on his return by a Genoese businessman. And here are his travels. Venice there, around here. And the Polo family, you can see this picture, receiving gifts from Kublai Khan. Alright, so what else happened? At the end of the Yuan Dynasty, the Black Plague spread by the Mongols in the mid-14th century. They sent fleets against Japan, and they were not successful. They were defeated by the Japanese using the kamikazes, or the winds of the gods. Their fleets were destroyed, and Kublai Khan had several other defeats in Southeast Asia. Alright, so that kind of wraps up them for us today.